Hello everyone, welcome to PW English YouTube channel. I'm Shalini Somashekar, your botany teacher, and in today's lecture, we are going to be summarizing the chapter Ecosystem in one shot as a part of your summary series. So let's begin today's lecture by trying to understand what the term ecosystem means. In the previous chapter, organisms and populations, we have learnt about ecosystem as a level in biological organization, right? We've learnt about species and then population and then ecosystem. After population, you have communities and then you have ecosystem and then you have biome and then you have biosphere. All about that we've discussed in the previous chapter. So in this chapter, we're going to specifically be learning about ecosystems, what are its functional components, how does everything in nature work so beautifully and how the living things are interacting with the abiotic factors, all of that we're going to focus on. Alright, so let's begin today's lecture by trying to learn about what the term ecosystem refers to. Ecosystem. Eco is basically when you're learning about your environment. A system is a system that is present in your environment. So a system, an ecosystem is a functional unit of nature. It is a self-sustainable functional unit of nature where living organisms or biotic components are constantly interacting among themselves and also are interacting with the non-living components or the abiotic components of nature, such as water and soil and sunlight and temperature, all of that. So how can we define an ecosystem? An ecosystem, like I mentioned, is a functional unit of nature. So just like we say cell is the basic unit of life, an ecosystem is the basic unit, functional unit of nature where living organisms and non-living things are both part of it and they're interacting with each other. Okay? So a functional unit of nature where living organisms interact among themselves and also with the surrounding physical environment is what we call an ecosystem. An ecosystem size is greatly variable. Something as small as a pond is also considered an ecosystem, and something as large as an ocean or as large as a forest is also an ecosystem. So it is not necessary that the geographical area has to be of a certain specific size for us to call it an ecosystem. The size is highly variable. And we have different ways of classifying ecosystems. One of the ways in which you can classify ecosystems is based on where that ecosystem is present. Is it on land or is it inside water? If it's on land, we call it terrestrial ecosystem. If it is in water, we call it aquatic ecosystem. What are some examples for terrestrial ecosystem? Forests. Forests are present on land. Grasslands are present on land. Deserts are present on land. All of these are ecosystems that you find on land. So these are examples for terrestrial ecosystems. Similarly, you have ecosystems in water as well. It could be salt water, it could be fresh water. So depending upon what it is, you have different kinds of aquatic ecosystems. You have ponds, you have lakes, you have wetlands, rivers, estuaries, seas, oceans. All of these are examples of aquatic ecosystem. Very simple to understand this classification. There's another way of classifying an ecosystem based on whether it's natural or man-made. Let me give you examples first. Natural ecosystem examples are forest and ocean. Man-made ecosystem examples are crop fields and aquarium. Now, what's the difference? In a forest, you have different kinds of plants, you have different kinds of animals, you have different types of microbes. Even in crop fields, you do find different types of plants, you do find different types of insects or animals there. You do find a different types of microbes. So what differentiates this from this? In nature or in natural ecosystems, nature chooses what kind of plants and what kind of animals and what kind of microbes should be there. In man-made ecosystem, there is human intervention, which is not there in natural ecosystems. Nobody went around forests and said, here I want a teak wood tree, here I want a sandalwood tree, and here maybe a frog would look nice. Nobody did that. That has happened by itself in nature. But if you take crop fields and aquarium, for example, in a crop field, if you are a farmer, if you are growing them, you decide what should grow there. You decide what plants you eliminate, right? In an aquarium, you want to choose the brighter colored fishes. You do not want some boring grey colored fishes in your aquarium. You want something very fancy, maybe something silver and glittery or something bright orange. So depending upon your preferences, you choose what stays in a artificial ecosystem, which is not the case in natural ecosystem. If you consider oceans, if you watch what is that, National Geographic channel or Animal Planet or BBC Earth or whatever, one of those channels, you will see how within the ocean there are so many different kinds of organisms, some of which are extremely beautiful to look at, very pleasing to the eye, very aesthetic, and there are organisms that are scary, right? So nature does not, in nature, in natural ecosystems, there is no human intervention and nature basically chooses what should stay, right? So that is the difference between a natural and a man-made ecosystem. Now, let's move on to learn about the structure of an ecosystem. We just learned about so many different kinds of ecosystem, right? On land, there are some. In the water, there are some. There are some kinds which are called natural ecosystems. There are some ecosystems which are man-made. All of that we know. Now, ecosystem definitely includes both biotic and abiotic components that we are already aware of. Because of the interaction between biotic and abiotic components, that will result in the formation of a characteristic physical structure for that type of ecosystem, right? So whenever you close your eyes and I say desert, you will picturize sand. Whenever I say you close your eyes and imagine a forest, you will imagine like a lot of tall trees, maybe a lot of birds and animals and all of that. So every ecosystem has its characteristic physical structure. All right. So one example for that would be stratification. If you consider forests, it could be rainforest, it could be temperate forest. Whenever you consider forests, you know there is a specific type of vertical distribution or vertical zonation that you see in forests. Strata basically means layer, okay? So stratification is finding different layers where different kinds of plants are present. So we're considering a forest area, a forest ecosystem, and in this forest ecosystem, you're looking at the different kinds of plants that are present, okay? So if you see here, you can see in this strata or in this bottommost layer, in this vertical zone, you find mostly grasses and short herbaceous plants. In the next zone, you might find bushy herbs. In the topmost zone or the vertical strata, you will find tall trees that are probably forming a canopy. So in that way, you find different layers where different kinds of plants are present, right? So stratification can be defined as the vertical distribution of different species that are physically occupying different levels. Okay, so that is one example for a structure that you can see in ecosystems like forests. Similarly, different ecosystems will have different structures characteristic to that ecosystem. You will not find such a vertical zonation or a stratification in deserts, right? This is characteristic to forests. Like that, there will be something characteristic to deserts. All right. Now, in any ecosystem, you will have living organisms, right? Identifying what all living organisms are there in an ecosystem and enumerating all of those plant and animal species is what we call species composition. Important to remember what species composition means. For example, when we're talking about medicines, you go ask for a medicine at the medical store and that person says, we do not have this exact medicine, but we have something that has the same composition. What does that mean? Whatever things are present in the medicine that you're looking for, with the exact same components, there is another medicine available of a different brand with a different name probably. So that is what composition is. What all are the things that are inside that medicine? So if you relate that with ecosystem, we are talking about species composition. So what are the different species that are present in that particular ecosystem? What are the different kinds of plants? What are the different species of plants? What are the different species of animals? Identifying what those are, identifying their scientific names and enumerating them is what gives us the species composition of any ecosystem. All right. Now, What are some of the functional aspects of an ecosystem? Ecosystem performs various functions because, like I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, it is a self-sustainable unit. How is it self-sustainable? Because of all of these functional aspects of the ecosystem, it can sustain itself, right? So, yeah, the components of an ecosystem are seen to function as a unit when you consider these aspects. What are the aspects? There's productivity, decomposition, energy flow, and nutrient cycling. Productivity, decomposition, energy flow, and nutrient cycling. We are going to learn in detail about three of these. Nutrient cycling has been deleted in your rationalized syllabus. Okay, so I'll tell you briefly what nutrient cycling is. Nutrient cycling is how the nutrients in different parts of the ecosystem get cycled around. For example, if you consider carbon or phosphorus, you know how it is getting cycled between the biotic and abiotic components in an ecosystem. That is what we would usually learn in nutrient cycling, but that part is deleted, so nothing to worry. Almost as much as 40% of the syllabus from the earlier syllabus has been deleted in your rationalized syllabus. So yeah, that part is deleted. All right. So yeah. So to understand an example of how an ecosystem sustains itself, let's take the example of pond. I told you in the beginning itself, pond is an example for an aquatic ecosystem. So what is a pond? Pond is a water body. Pond is a water body that's not very deep. It's not as deep as seas. It's not as deep as oceans. It is a shallow water body. In this pond, you have biotic components as well as abiotic components like in all ecosystems. What are some of the abiotic components that you find in pond? Obviously water. Water will be there. And dissolved in that water, you will have many substances that could be inorganic or organic, right? So in the pond, you find water. At the base of the pond, you will find soil. This soil will be deposited. The soil is present at the bottom of the pond. To the pond, there will be input of solar energy, sunlight. It receives sunlight, right? That is an abiotic factor. There is cycling of temperature and day length. So that all of these are abiotic factors in a pond. What are some of the biotic factors? Of course, in a pond you find plants, you find animals, you find microbes and all of that, right? What are the abiotic factors that biotic components that you find in a pond? There will be producers or autotrophic organisms. What are these autotrophic organisms? Those that have the ability to perform photosynthesis. The autotrophic components include phytoplankton. What are these phytoplankton? They are all of these microscopic photosynthetic organisms that float on the surface of a water body. So you find phytoplanktons, some algae, some of algae are also phytoplanktons, but yeah, apart from that you can find larger algae. There are plants that you find in water bodies like ponds that could be floating on the surface or it could be submerged. At the margin of the pond, you find plants, right? You call them marginal plants. They are found at the edge of the pond. So these are the different kinds of plants that you can see in a pond ecosystem. What about consumers? I'm sure you know what consumers are. Consumers are those organisms that feed on plants directly or indirectly. Okay? So the consumers include zooplankton. Planktonic forms they float on water. If it's a phytoplankton, it is a photosynthetic organism floating on water. If it is a zooplankton, it is a consumer floating on water. Okay. So you have zooplankton. There are some free swimming consumers and also bottom dwelling forms. Talking about the decomposers, these are microorganisms like fungi and bacteria, and you even have certain flagellates. All of these are the different biotic components that you find in a pond. Now what happens here is the autotrophic organisms that are there make use of water, they make use of sunlight, and in the right optimum temperature, it will synthesize food. because you're autotrophs. These consumers feed on the autotrophs. When the autotrophs and the consumers die, they settle at the bottom. At the bottom, you have high quantity of these decomposers. So when they settle down in the soil, all of these decomposers, they will start acting on the organic matter in your producers and consumers, decompose it, and all of the nutrients that were present in the dead organisms will be broken down, decomposed, and returned to the soil, right? So you can see how energy is flowing through different trophic levels over here. You can see how biotic and abiotic components are interacting with each other in an ecosystem. If not for these, if not for water, if not for sunlight, these organisms would not be able to make food, right? So they need those abiotic components to make food. If not for autotrophs, the consumers would not have food. If not for these both dying, the decomposers would not have had food, right? The reason why the soil here is rich soil, nutrient rich, is because these organisms are decomposing the organic matter and adding the nutrients to the soil deposit at the bottom. So you can see how both of them are interacting with each other and how energy is flowing from one type of organisms to another type of organism by means of feeding on them, right? So you can see how this is functioning as a unit. We took pond as an example, but in every ecosystem you can find this, right? Now let's talk about the first component, which is called productivity. You know how for plants to photosynthesize, sunlight is absolutely essential, right? Photosynthesis itself means photo is sunlight, right? They're synthesizing something because of sunlight. So basically, a constant input of solar energy is the basic requirement for any ecosystem to function properly. Okay? There are ecosystems where light does not, light does not even penetrate. For example, if you take very deep parts of the ocean, it's extremely dark, right? There's no light there because light cannot penetrate so into the deeper areas of oceans and seas. So over there, definitely there are other ways, but in most parts, in most ecosystems, sunlight itself acts as the primary source of energy. So making use of sunlight, plants perform photosynthesis and they synthesize food. Over here, how much ever biomass or organic matter, the amount or the quantity, how much, the amount of biomass or organic matter that plants produce by making use of sunlight per unit area over a given period of time is what we refer to as primary production. So remember, primary production is about plants or our producers. Primary production is production. We're talking about production. Production of what? Production of biomass or organic matter. By whom? By plants. What is being used to produce this? Sunlight is being used. So if you were to calculate primary production, you're going to consider unit area at a particular given time. So how would you express it? It can be expressed in terms of weight. We're talking about how much is produced, right? How much organic matter is produced. So that can be expressed in terms of weight. Weight in terms, with respect to a weight, the unit could be grams. These many grams of organic matter or biomass per meter square. This is the area. Unit area I said, right? So per meter square, this is the amount of organic matter that the plants are producing by making use of sunlight. Or you could measure it in terms of energy. So the organic matter that is produced in this particular area of 1 meter square for a particular period of time, how much energy does that organic matter or biomass have? that can be expressed in terms of kilocalories per meter square. So you either express it in terms of its weight per meter square, or you express it in terms of how much energy does that biomass carry per meter square. That will give us the primary production and not productivity. When we talk about primary productivity, time comes in. So primary productivity is the rate of biomass production. At what rate is it being produced? Production is just how much of it is being produced. Productivity is at what rate it is being produced. So whenever we have rate, you may have learnt in physics as well, time comes in. When we are talking about the rate of something, we are talking about it with respect to time. In these many minutes, how much production has taken place. In the next 1 minute, how much is going to take place. So with respect to time, if you are, kind of measuring it, that gives us the rate. So productivity is the rate at which this biomass is being produced. If you're considering time, definitely while you're expressing it, you will have that in your unit, right? So if you're expressing productivity in terms of weight, it's going to be gram per square per year. In 1 year, in a period of 1 year, how much was the production? That gives us the rate. And in terms of energy, it's going to be kilocalories per meter square per year. So by checking the productivity, you can kind of compare two different types of ecosystems. We have forests on one hand, we have deserts on one hand. So this is the productivity of forests, this is the productivity of deserts in a year. Which one is more productive? Even in schools or in offices for us, while at work, productivity is a very, very important parameter to determine how well somebody is working, how well somebody is studying, right? So I take, let's say, 2 hours to prepare for a class, and then I take that particular class, I finish in 1 hour. So totally in 3 hours, I'm delivering one lecture. And there's another person probably who does preparation and delivery both in 2 hours. We are giving the same content, but that other person is more productive than me because he's utilizing lesser time to give the same content, right? So that is very similarly, we make use of productivity to measure how well two different types of ecosystems are doing, right? So that's productivity for you. What is primary productivity? Primary productivity is the rate at which primary production is happening. At what rate biomass is being produced by plants. Whenever we use primary, it's with respect to producers. Whenever we use secondary in productivity, that is with respect to consumers. So primary productivity is of two kinds. There is, you can measure that in terms of, in two ways basically. One is gross primary productivity, which is abbreviated as GPP, and the other one is net primary productivity, which is abbreviated as NPP. So what's the difference between gross productivity and net primary productivity? If at all you've seen any of your parents' salary slips, or if you have heard people talk about gross and net, see, for example, I get X amount of salary. That is my gross salary. From that, there will be some deductions. There will be some amount reduced in the form of tax. Okay. What I get in my hand is my net salary. Before the taxes are reduced, what my salary is the gross. After the tax is reduced, what my salary is my net salary. Very similarly, you have gross primary productivity and net primary productivity. Always gross primary productivity is going to be greater than net primary productivity. So what is gross primary productivity? It takes into account all of the biomass that is produced during photosynthesis. The rate at which the entire organic matter is produced by plants by the process of photosynthesis. See, animals feed on plants, or animals feed on animals that feed on plants. Okay. Ultimately, in nature, there is flow of energy from sun to producers, producers to consumers. regardless of whether you directly eat plants or you indirectly eat plants by eating animals that eat plants, plants' function is not to be food for us. Plants are not alive because they want us to eat it. Plants are alive because they are also organisms like us, and they also want to live, and they also want to continue their species over time. In order for plants to live, they should spend energy. For photosynthesis, they are spending energy. Energy is spent by means of respiration, right? Breakdown happens, energy is released. So, whatever biomass is synthesized by plants, some of it is used up by plants as well. For example, a plant produces glucose. It produces 10 molecules of glucose. It needs to produce like 5 more molecules of glucose. For that, it needs energy. This is our biomass. It needs to produce more glucose molecules to sustain its growth. For the production of those glucose molecules, energy is required. Where do we get that energy from? This glucose will get broken down by a process called cellular respiration, and that process will lead energy for more synthesis of glucose. So some of the biomass gets used up in respiration. We call that respiratory loss. A considerable amount of GPP or gross primary productivity is utilized by plants in respiration. You minus GPP by respiratory loss, what you get is NPP. So plants are there, they are synthesizing some biomass, some of which they are using, and that gets broken down by the process of respiration. So whatever is broken down is not available for consumers. Whatever remains in the plant after respiratory loss, whatever is remaining in the plant for the consumers, that is called net primary productivity, and that's what is represented as NPP. Alright, so whatever is available, whatever biomass is available in the plant itself for the consumption of heterotrophs, which are the consumers, is what we call net primary productivity. I hope this is clear. Over here, R represents respiratory loss. Okay, I hope this is clear. Let's move on and talk about what are the different factors that affect primary productivity. Definitely, the primary productivity in a forest is going to be very different from a primary productivity in a grassland or a desert or an ocean. So what are the different factors that will affect primary productivity in a given ecosystem? Firstly, the plant species that are inhabiting that area. Some plants have more photosynthetic capacity than the others. You have learned in the chapter photosynthesis in 11th grade that C4 plants have more productivity compared to C3 plants. Also, plants with more number of leaves are more productive compared to plants with fewer leaves. Plants with wider leaves or broader leaves are more perform more photosynthesis. They have more photosynthetic capacity compared to plants that have narrower leaves. So it depends on what kind of plants are present in that area. Because in primary productivity, we're talking specifically about plants. How much biomass are they, at what rate is the biomass being produced by the plants, right? So it depends very clearly on what are the plant species that are present in that particular ecosystem. Environmental factors. So it could be a place where there's not sufficient sunlight, or it could be a place where there is moderate amount of sunlight, just enough for photosynthesis, and there could be an ecosystem where the sunlight is very harsh. So depending upon that, also you have different types of photosynthesis that plants will perform, right? If the sunlight is of optimum intensity, then photosynthesis will be more. If it's too harsh, or if it is what do we say, too dull, less intense, very less intense, even then photosynthesis will not occur properly. Environmental factors could include the nutrients in the soil, it could include the water that is available for the plant, it could include the temperature that is present around the plant, what is the humidity level, all of that will matter. All right, yeah, availability of nutrients also, and photosynthetic capacity of plants, like I already mentioned, different plants have different photosynthetic capacities. Depending upon that, the productivity of a particular ecosystem will vary. So it's important for you to remember all of these factors. It's very general knowledge. We just, making it more organized, giving it as points. Even if I didn't show you that slide, if I asked you what are the different things that could vary the productivity in an ecosystem, I'm sure you would have been able to say it, right? So it's very simple. Whatever processes affect photosynthesis, that is going to affect productivity, because in productivity what we are measuring is how much or at what rate the biomass is being synthesized, which in turn depends on photosynthesis. So whatever affects photosynthesis affects productivity, right? So now let's talk about secondary productivity. Secondary productivity is about consumers. We are consumers. We can't synthesize food by ourselves. We feed on plants and get our energy from that. Plant food, if I'm eating some soppu sambar today, like some green leaf curry today, the green leaf definitely has proteins. It probably has all the biomolecules, major biomolecules that we need, right? In the dal, there are proteins, carbohydrates and all of that. So it has it has, starch. It has, the rice has starch. The dal has protein. We're using a little bit of ghee that has fats, and the protein is present in the leaves that you're eating. So all of the different food components are present in it. So the starch that you eat doesn't remain starch in your body, right? In our body, food is not stored as starch, like carbohydrates is not stored as starch, it is stored as glycogen. So what happens to the starch I eat? The starch I eat gets broken down as it goes down my alimentary canal. In my mouth, it gets broken down. In my intestine, again, it gets broken down. By the time it reaches the end of small intestine, most of the macromolecules would have gotten broken down. But my body, if I have to build new cells, if I have to grow, if my fallen hair has to grow back, I need protein. But I have amino acids now. So even in my body, the food that I eat is broken down. The amino acids that are broken down should join again to form a protein. The glucose that has been broken down from starch has to join again to form a glycogen. So that is biosynthesis that is happening inside of my body. The protein that is there in my food will not remain protein in my, once it is digested. Once it is digested, that protein is broken down to amino acids. My body again has to make use of those amino acids and build the protein that it requires. There again, we are synthesizing newer biomass. We are synthesizing newer, organic matter. So, the rate of formation of new organic matter, whatever newer proteins, newer carbohydrates that we are going to synthesize in our body, by making use of the nutrients that we obtained from whatever we ate, that new biosynthesis, at what rate that is happening, that will give us secondary productivity. All right. So secondary productivity is about how much, at what rate do the consumers form new organic matter after the digestion of whatever they've eaten. Okay. Now, if you consider the annual NPP, net primary productivity, I've already told you what net primary productivity is. If you consider the annual net primary productivity, annual means per year, what is the net primary productivity of the entire biosphere throughout the earth, everywhere in the world? If you consider the net primary productivity, it's approximately 170 tons. How do we measure this? In terms of its dry weight. Why do we not measure wet weight? Because that will vary very drastically in different environmental conditions, right? So you measure the dry weight because that is a more reliable way to measure the biomass. We get throughout the earth, NPP is approximately 170 tons per year. All right. Now I want you to understand, I want you to remember how on earth, oceans, water bodies, basically oceans and seas, all of that occupies a large area, right? That's why earth is called the blue planet, because if you look at it from space, it appears blue because there's so much water. 70% of earth is water. Remaining 30% is land. Though the oceans and seas occupy as much as 70% on earth, when you look at its productivity, the productivity is not as high. It's just 55 billion tons. 55 billion tons is less than half of 170 tons. Now, if you look at the terrestrial ecosystems, though it's occupying merely 30% of the total area on Earth, its productivity is 115 billion tons. Oh wait, from that time I'm telling 170 tons, right? This is 170 billion tons. Yeah, so that is 170 billion tons of dry weight. Terrestrial is 115, and oceans, though it's occupying a lot of area, it's only about 55 billion tons. What is the reason for this? The reason, one of the primary reasons, is the availability of sunlight. On land, sunlight is easily available to plants, but only in the upper few layers of water bodies sunlight can penetrate. Very deep into the oceans, sunlight does not penetrate. Usually in the deep layers of water where it's extremely cold, temperature also is a point of concern, where you have very dark conditions, the temperature is very cold, light does not penetrate, therefore the productivity there is affected, which is not the case on land. Because of direct sunlight hitting the land, the temperature on most cases is optimal, and also the temperature is better than it is in oceans. Therefore, though the land occupies just about 30% of the total earth, the productivity is more than twice as that of the oceans. Okay, so yeah. Now let's talk about the second aspect, functional aspect, which is decomposition. I'm sure you've heard of decomposition generally or even in your lower grades. Decomposition is how nutrients get cycled between different components in an ecosystem. What happens during decomposition? A dead or decaying organ, plant, animal falls on the soil. There are microbes that will act upon that organism. Whatever nutrients that organism has will go back to the soil so that the plants can use them. Over here, we have the dead organism. You have the living microbes that are acting on it, and all of those nutrients are definitely, some of those nutrients are used up by the microbes for their source of energy, and also some of it will get transferred to an abiotic component, soil. So from this, plants can obtain their nutrition. So that is how the nutrients will get cycled between biotic and abiotic components in nature. Decomposition is very, very important when it comes to nutrient cycling, because there are many elements that will get cycled because of the process of decomposition. All right. So what is decomposition by definition? It is the process by which complex organic matter, it could be carbohydrates, it could be proteins, it could be nucleic acids, these complex organic matter that are present in living organisms, that get broken down. Broken down to produce what? Inorganic substances. Like what? Carbon dioxide, water, and mineral nutrients. So these will get complex organic matter gets broken down, and it forms simpler molecules like carbon dioxide, water, and certain nutrients. Over here, it's important for us to understand a term called detritus. You may or may not have heard this before, so pay attention. What is detritus? When plants or animals die, it falls on the ground, right? Plant parts, they're falling down all the time. It could be dry leaves, it could be bark, it could be flowers, it could be a twig. All of that fresh material that is falling on the ground is what we refer to as detritus. If you consider animals, even animal parts including the fecal matter is included under detritus. This detritus is going to act as the raw material for decomposers. Decomposers will act on these. It will break down the organic matter in these fallen down leaves and twigs and flowers and bark and excreta and all of that. Therefore, the detritus is the raw material for decomposers. Now let's try to understand what are the steps involved in the process of decomposition. I'm going to say step 1, step 2, step 3, but I want you to understand that all of these processes are happening simultaneously. Though in your notes, what is the spelling of simultaneous? I've forgotten O here. Yeah. So though these are given as 1, 2, 3, all of those processes are simultaneously happening on the detritus. The first step is called, one of the steps is fragmentation. What happens during fragmentation? Fragment means what? Something that is big is being broken down. That's exactly what happens during fragmentation. Very clearly we're talking about detritus. So in fragmentation, detritus is getting broken down. Who is breaking it down? Living organisms. What kind of living organisms? They are called detritivores, or some literature you even find it as detrivores. One example for a detritivore is earthworm. You may have heard that they say earthworm is the farmer's best friend, right? Why do they say that? That is because it helps in the cycling of nutrients. All of the dead plant and animal remains will be broken down by the help of these earthworms, and that will add a lot of nutrients to the soil. So if the nutrients are added to the soil will be more fertile. If the farmer grows his plants on that cropland, then he's going to get better yield. Basically, that's why the earthworms are called the farmer's best friend, right? So over here, in fragmentation, detritivores like earthworms, they break down the detritus into smaller particles. So there is detritus, earthworm is acting on it, breaking it down. Simultaneously, what happens is, if in that detritus there are any molecules that are water soluble, there are any nutrients that are water soluble, that will dissolve in water. After the nutrients from the detritus dissolves in water, what happens? We are talking about all of these processes on soil, right? So in the soil you have different layers. In the soil there are soil particles. The soil particles, between the soil particles there are spaces, right? So the water that absorbs, or not absorbs, that the water in which these soluble nutrients are dissolved, that water goes down the different layers of the soil, in between the soil particles, in all of those spaces, and will go to the bottom layers of the soil in a process called leaching. And once it reaches the bottom, it will get precipitated there as salts. Now these salts will be unavailable. Unavailable to whom? To the plants that will grow there. Okay, so that is leaching. Next is catabolism. Over here in fragmentation, the organism that was used is an earthworm. In catabolism, we are talking about microorganisms or saprotrophs. We also call them saprotrophs, that depend on dead and decaying matter to obtain their nutrition. So this includes bacteria and fungi. What do? These bacteria and fungi will release enzymes to the outside of the body. These enzymes will have the ability to break the detritus down. Break the complex matter in the detritus, complex molecules in the detritus can be broken down by the help of these enzymes. So once they are broken down into simpler molecules, these microbes will absorb them. Not all of them, some of them. Some of them remain in the soil and add to its fertility, right? So yeah, that is catabolism. Next we have humification. So as all of these processes are simultaneously occurring on the detritus, a dark colored amorphous substance forms. It forms and it accumulates, and this substance is called humus. Now this humus is highly resistant to microbial activity. This will undergo decomposition at a very slow rate because it is resistant to microbial activity. It is colloidal in nature. This humus will act as a reservoir of nutrients. Finally, last step, mineralization. What is mineralization? Very simple. By the term itself, you can understand. When the humus will get further degraded by microbes, nutrient minerals or mineral nutrients will get released into the soil. That is called mineralization. So these are your 5 important steps in decomposition. Very, very important question for your board exams, right? Now, what are some factors that affect the rate of decomposition? Oxygen definitely is a factor. decomposition is an oxygen requiring process because most of the decomposer organisms are aerobic heterotrophs. So with the help of oxygen is what is how they can break down the detritus. So oxygen is an absolute requirement. It requires large amounts of oxygen. Whenever there's more oxygen, there's better decomposition, quicker decomposition. When there's less oxygen or the oxygen content is limiting, then the rate of decomposition is going to be slow. Chemical composition of the detritus. What is detritus made of? If it is plants, you know how some plant walls contain lignin. The cell walls in some cells in plants contain lignin. In insect exoskeleton, there's chitin. In fungal cell walls, there is chitin. So substances like chitin and lignin are a little difficult to break down. So if the detritus contains these kind of molecules, then the rate of decomposition will become slow. As opposed to that, if the detritus is rich in nitrogen and substances that are soluble by water, like sugars, then it happens very quickly. Next, temperature as well as soil moisture. This is water. Temperature has to be warm. Warm does not mean high temperature. Warm is like not too hot, not too cold. If the temperature is too high, decomposition will be slow. If the temperature is too low, decomposition is going to be slow. If it is warm, decomposition happens at a fast rate. If the moisture is also, if the water content is also just enough, moist enough, then decomposition will be high. If there's too much water, it will be low. If there's very little water, even then it's going to be low. Low temperature and anaerobiosis. Anaerobiosis is little oxygen content that will result in slowing down decomposition or inhibiting decomposition, as a result of which the organic matter will start to accumulate in that ecosystem. Right? Now, let's discuss the third aspect, functional aspect, that is energy flow. Like I've been telling from the start, sun is the major source of energy for all the ecosystems on earth, except for certain very few ecosystems where sunlight does not penetrate at all, as the case of very deep layers or regions in the ocean. For example, deep sea hydrothermal ecosystem, over there is no sign of sunlight. It's very dark areas except for those regions. In most other ecosystems, sun itself is the source of energy. Now, whatever sunlight reaches the earth, this sunlight, you know, if you consider the electromagnetic spectrum of sunlight, you know how only the visible light or the visible region between 400 to 700 nanometers is what the plants can absorb, and make use of that they perform photosynthesis. Apart from that, whatever exists is not, you know, using those wavelengths of light, plants cannot synthesize food. Okay, so that specific region in sunlight is what we call the PAR, which is short for photosynthetically active radiation. So from whatever sunlight is incident on earth, less than 50% of it is what plants can absorb and perform photosynthesis. That is called photosynthetically active radiation. Of this photosynthetically active radiation, plants capture only 2 to 10%. Plants capture only 2 to 10%. Just that 2 to 10% itself will sustain pretty much all life on earth, right? So the plants make use of this sun's energy to synthesize organic food or organic matter, and then whatever organic matter is synthesized by plants will flow through different organisms. That energy, whatever plants fix by making use of sunlight, it is not trapped in plants forever. So the plants will make use of some of the food that they've synthesized. Remaining things will be eaten by plants and eaten by animals, and some other animals will eat those animals. So it's all getting transferred between different organisms. What kind of producers do you find in terrestrial ecosystems? There will be herbaceous plants, there will be woody plants. If you consider aquatic ecosystems, over there you can find phytoplankton, algae, and even higher plants, right? So let's talk about a type of food chain called grazing food chain. Grazing food chain involves grazing, meaning animals feeding on plants, right? So a grazing food chain begins with plants. This grazing food chain is formed in such a way that an animal feeds on a plant. So there is a plant, an animal feeds on it, another animal feeds on this animal. So there is interdependency of this animal on this plant, this animal depends on this animal for food. So there is interdependency between different organisms here. Like I already mentioned, whatever energy is there in the plant, it's not trapped there forever, it goes into different organisms. What if there's a plant and no animal feeds on it? It will die, it will fall on the ground, it will be food for decomposers. Decomposers will produce enzymes, break it down, form simple inorganic substances, absorb them for their nutrition. So that is what will basically happen. So whatever energy is fixed by the plants will not stay with them forever. Either it gets eaten by other organisms or it falls to the ground, and then the decomposers will make use of that detritus, right? Huh. So all animals definitely depend on plants. It could be either directly or indirectly for their food requirements. If organisms feed directly on plants, then they are called primary consumers. Plants are producers. Plants are producers. If an animal depends directly on the producers, we call them primary consumers. Which are the primary consumers? Herbivorous animals. If an animal eats another animal that depends on the plant, so it indirectly depends on the plant, then we call them secondary consumers. Who are the secondary consumers? The carnivores, right? These are terms that you should understand. Here is a simple, very simple example for a grazing food chain. It starts with a plant, a producer, which is a grass. This grass is eaten by a herbivore or a primary consumer, which is the goat. Further, man, who is a carnivore or a secondary consumer, feeds on this goat. So this is a very simple example of a grazing food chain. Now let's talk about the second type of food chain, which is called detritus food chain. It is represented as DFC, that is the abbreviation. This, as the name itself will indicate, begins with dead organic matter, which is nothing but our detritus. Detritus food chain is composed of decomposers, saprotrophic heterotrophs, which break down the detritus by making use of enzymes, by secreting enzymes, and they will absorb it later. Now, when you consider different types of ecosystems, what is the predominant type of food chain there varies. If you consider an aquatic ecosystem, grazing food chain is the major conduit for energy. As opposed to that, if you consider a terrestrial ecosystem, much larger fraction of energy flows through the detritus food chain rather than the grazing food chain. You might think of the opposite because there are more plants on land compared to oceans or aquatic ecosystem. You might think that on land it is GFC, more GFC, but it's the opposite. On land it is more DFC, and in an aquatic ecosystem it's mostly GFC. There are several levels at which the DFC may be connected with the GFC. For example, there is detritus, an earthworm is feeding on the detritus, there is detritus food chain. A sparrow coming and feeding on this earthworm is grazing food chain. So in nature, there will be intersection, interconnection, which is what will give rise to food webs, right? Also, there are organisms that are not strictly herbivores or carnivores. They are omnivorous in nature. They feed on plant matter as well as animal matter. So they are omnivores. That also will bring about an interconnection between different food chains and create a food web. All right. Now, yeah. According to what we feed on, we belong to specific trophic levels. Depending upon how are you obtaining your nutrition, what are you eating, you have different trophic levels. First one is producers. Like I've been saying, they make their own food. They absorb the sunlight, make their own food. That is the first trophic level. Animals that eat plants which are herbivorous, they are the primary consumers. That occupies the secondary trophic level. Carnivorous organisms that feed on other animals that eat plants, they are secondary consumers, which is the third trophic level. So your first trophic level producer, second trophic level is primary consumer, your third trophic level is your secondary consumer. So these are the different trophic levels. Always energy will pass from the lower trophic level to the next trophic level. From the first trophic level producers, energy will pass on to the primary consumers. From the primary consumers, energy will pass on to the secondary consumers. Okay, so there's unidirectional flow of energy from the lower trophic level to the higher trophic level. And how much ever energy is passed on, that amount of energy will decrease at the successive trophic levels. Yeah, whenever an organism dies, that energy is converted and used as a source of energy for decomposers. I've already told you this. Now, at each trophic level, there is a certain mass of living material which we call the biomass. At a particular time, at any particular time in each trophic level, consider the producers in that ecosystem, or the primary consumers in that ecosystem, or the secondary consumers in that ecosystem. At any time in a given ecosystem, each trophic level will have a specific biomass, and that is what we refer to as standing crop. Whatever biomass is present in a particular trophic level at a particular time, that is the standing crop. How do you measure that? In the same way you measure biomass. It can be measured in terms of biomass or in terms of number in a unit area. If we are measuring it in terms of biomass, it can be expressed in terms of dry weight or wet weight. We usually rely on dry weight because that is more accurate, because water content in different organisms are variable with respect to the surrounding environment. Therefore, dry weight is a more accurate and reliable measure. When we consider a grazing food chain, the number of trophic levels there is limited. That is because transfer of energy follows something called the 10% law. Whatever energy is present in the producers, only 10% of it will go to the primary consumers. Whatever energy is there in the primary consumers, only 10% of it will be transferred to the secondary consumers. That is called the 10% law. As you go higher up the trophic levels, as you go to the next trophic level, the amount of energy that is passed on will get smaller and smaller, because 90% of it is lost as heat. Only 10% gets passed on. Eventually, it will be so little that you can't afford to have another trophic level, right? So here you can see an illustration explaining trophic food chains and food webs. Okay, so first you have the sunlight. Plants make use of sunlight, synthesize photosynthesis, and if it dies, then detritivores will act on it. Herbivores eat plants. Carnivores eat animals that eat plants. So here you have a fourth trophic level, which is tertiary consumers. So there's only a maximum of these many trophic levels that you have in a grazing food chain. Now let's learn about ecological pyramids. It is used for what? What are these ecological pyramids? They are used to express the relationship between food or energy between different organisms at different trophic levels. There are three parameters that are usually studied: pyramid of number, pyramid of biomass, pyramid of energy. It can be studied in terms of number, organic biomass, or how much amount of organic matter is present, and in terms of energy. Now, whenever we are considering any of these parameters, we have to ensure that we are taking into account all of the organisms in that ecosystem at that particular trophic level. So, when we consider the first trophic level producers in a grassland, you have to take into account all of the photosynthetic organisms there, and what is their number, if it's a pyramid of number, or how much energy is present in them, or what is the biomass. You have to consider every organism in that particular trophic level, right? That is when you get a clear idea. Yeah, one thing is that some organisms may occupy more than one trophic level simultaneously. Therefore, this trophic level that we're talking about represents a functional level and not a specific species as such. For example, if you consider a sparrow, it will feed on worms, it will feed on nuts. If it's feeding on a nut, it will be a primary consumer. If it's feeding on a worm, then it's a secondary consumer. So it's possible that one organism can be part of more than one trophic level. So when you're considering consumers, it depends on what the sparrow is eating at that point, right? So you cannot fit in sparrow always as a primary consumer or as a secondary consumer. So it is not a specific representation of the species. We are trying to represent it at the functional level. Yeah, so let's take a look at the pyramid of number. Generally, the pyramid of number is going to be upright, but there are cases where it can be inverted or it can take some other different shapes as well. Here, we are looking at a pyramid of number in a grassland. In a grassland, definitely, there's going to be a lot of grasses. So, in this pyramid, it's always going to be, by convention, producer at the bottom. All of these bars represent how many are present in that particular trophic level. If the number of producers in a particular ecosystem is more, that bar is going to be very wide. If there are not many, that bar is going to be a little narrow, right? So over here, you can see how the producer number is very high. It's given here. It's for 58,42,000 producers. Primary consumers that feed on the grass is 7,08,000. So the bar is a little narrow. Secondary consumer is even less, 3,54,000. We're talking about numbers here. And then finally, tertiary consumer, there are only 3 of them. Therefore, a pyramid of number is upright here. But there are cases where the pyramid of number will not be upright also. Okay, so this is not always a given. Now let's consider the pyramid of biomass over here. Here you can see the pyramid of biomass in a terrestrial ecosystem. Here you can see the plant producer biomass is 809 kilograms of dry weight per meter square. So this is highest, followed by primary consumer, followed by secondary consumer, followed by tertiary consumer. If you look at a pyramid of biomass in an aquatic habitat like a sea or an aquatic ecosystem like a sea, it's going to be inverted. Though generally it is upright, it sometimes can be inverted as well, because if you consider the biomass of plants in a sea as opposed to the biomass of fishes or animals in a sea, the biomass of fishes far exceeds the biomass of plants, because of which you get an inverted pyramid. Now let's take a look at the third type of pyramid, which is the pyramid of energy. This is all the time, always, without an exception, going to be upright. Why? Because I already told you about the 10% law. Highest energy always is going to be in the producers. 10% of it is going to pass on to the consumers. 10% of this is going to pass on to the secondary consumer. 10% of this is going to pass on to the tertiary consumer. So always from sunlight, 10% is producer. So always there's going to be a 90% loss of energy in the form of heat. Therefore, it's always going to be upright. The lowest trophic level is going to carry the highest amount of energy. So that's always going to be upright. Though the ecological pyramids are going to give us lot of insights into how an ecosystem functions, what are the different relationships with respect to food among different organisms, there are some drawbacks or limitations of ecological pyramids. 3 important points. If there is some species that belongs to 2 or more trophic levels, like the sparrow example that I told you, they will not take that into consideration. Ecological pyramids does not take that into consideration. Also, it will always assume a simple food chain, but in nature, simple food chain does not exist, right? We just spoke about how so many food chains are interconnected and forms a food web. They do not take that into consideration. Therefore, that is another drawback. And also, we are not including or giving any place to decomposers or saprophytes, which have such an important ecological role to play in an ecosystem. Because of these 3 things, there are some limitations to ecological pyramids. So with this, we have come to the end of the lecture. I hope it was helpful. I hope you stayed till the end and completed the lecture. All the very best for your exams. Thank you. I'll see you soon.